Hello, everybody. Welcome. If you are tuning in, I would love to hear where you are listening from tonight. I'm here in Seattle, and Katherine and Christy are in New York. Feel free to drop into the chat where you're listening from and what you're sipping on if you're participating in a beverage tonight. And if you select the all panelists and attendees button within the chat, then everyone will be able to see your message. We are going to get started here in just a few minutes, but I wanted to welcome everyone on behalf of Book Larder. My name is Meghna. Book Larder is in the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle. We are a cookbook shop. And one of the lucky surprises, I think, of the last year is being able to reach folks from all over the country and all over the world through our virtual events. I see there are folks listening in from St. Paul, Minnesota. Hello, Giuliani from New York. Denise from Lummi Island. Welcome in. Like I said, we're just going to get started in a few minutes here. Wow, we've got someone listening from Auckland, New Zealand. Hello, Sydney. Hello, Ted, up on North 47th. Tonight, we are going to be talking with Katherine Clary, who's the author of this lovely new book that actually was released this last year in 2020 during the pandemic. So doing a virtual book tour sort of type of thing today. And the book is called Wine Unfiltered. It's a super handy guide for buying, drinking, and sharing natural wine. So Katherine's going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And she will be joined by Christy Frank, who is a writer, a sommelier, and a wine retail leader. Both of them are tuning in from New York on the East Coast. So the sun is rapidly setting over there. We're really excited to have the both of them. We'll get started in just a few moments here. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please do feel free to drop them into the Q&A button at the very bottom of your screen. That way we'll be able to answer them in a timely manner. We'll hold questions, most of the questions throughout the event till the end of the conversation. We'll get to as many as we can, but if something comes up that's super pertinent to what Katherine and Christy are talking about, then we'll try to get to your question during the event as well. I will drop a link to the book in the chat for anyone that is interested in purchasing the book and learning more about natural wine. This author talk also will be posted on our YouTube channel post-event. So if you know someone who is also interested in natural wine, or who wasn't able to attend tonight, that will be up on our YouTube channel within 48 hours. That's all that I have. I'm going to turn it over to Katherine and Christy. Thank you both for joining us tonight. We're so excited to hear from you both. And again, congratulations on your new book.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Yeah, so this is Christy Frank. I'm really excited to talk to her tonight. And Meghna, thank you so much for having both of us. Thanks, Book Larder, for hosting us. Yeah, we're just gonna have a little chat tonight about Wine Unfiltered, my new book, or newish book. Came out about 6 months ago. And yeah, I'm excited to talk a bit about kind of how I got into natural wine and yeah, where we think it's going. Christy is a great figure in wine and a real champion of low intervention winemaking. She started Frankly Wines, which was a great wine shop in New York City, and now is a co-founder and co-owner of Copic Wineworks, which is in upstate New York, among many other things that you do, Christy, right? Writing and editing and somming and all of that. So yeah.
Yeah, so it's great to be here. And we thought we were just going to have a little conversation, and I'll kick off asking you the question that everybody seems to ask at every wine-related event, which is, how did you get into wine? Tell us a little bit about your wine journey.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I touch on this in my book too. It's kind of the way that I introduce it, but I had been drinking wine, like many people, just since my early 20s, maybe even before that. Probably had my first glass when I was like 18 or something like that, and definitely, it was something somewhat nondescript. It didn't really resonate with me. I never really understood what the hype was with wine. And I went on drinking wine like that probably for a good, 10 years up until my late 20s or so. And about, I would say 5-6 years ago, I had been going up to the Finger Lakes, which for those of you unfamiliar, the Finger Lakes are in Western New York, just up near the border of Canada. And I had some family that was from there, and just started going up there 5 or 6 years ago to reconnect with some of my family. And I started visiting all these wineries with my cousins. And, the Finger Lakes, certainly known as a wine region in New York, but not necessarily known as being like a champion of low intervention or natural wines up there. Though there are some incredible producers, which I probably will shout out in a bit. And, it was kind of the first time that I actually saw vineyards up close and actually started to kind of connect wine to a place and, people, then realizing that there are people behind it, there are farmers behind it. But there was still, a bit of a disconnect, and the wines that I was tasting, I wasn't necessarily loving until I discovered 2 winemakers up there named Bloomer Creek. And it turns out I had stumbled upon kind of like, 2 legends of natural winemaking, at least in Northeastern US. I would say in the US as a whole, Kim Engel and Deborah Birmingham have really kind of paved the way for that type of winemaking. So I really kind of struck out with that being my first experience of tasting wine.
No, you hit a home run. You hit a home run.
Yeah. And, they, again, they were just so welcoming, and they talked to me in a way that they didn't talk down to me when I didn't know what I was tasting, or, maybe didn't fully understand the winemaking process. They just really, it was the first time I think I had spoken to wine people, and it felt like we were, I don't know, seeing eye to eye on something. So it was really welcoming, and it was kind of a breakthrough moment for me.
Yeah, no, it's kind of you were at the time, I think, working at the green markets in the New York City green markets. And I mean, these are the bastions of where's this tomato come from, and what's the name of the chicken, and all of that. So you were very well versed in sort of this idea of where does the food come from, who's growing it, all of that sort of stuff. But you weren't, were you taking that same sort of approach to your wine at that point?
Not at all. And, it was a total blind spot, which I think that happens to a lot of people. I think for some reason, wine isn't really thought of as an agricultural product. And luckily that's really changing, I think, with low intervention wine and with natural wine. But I was working for Grow NYC, which is a really great nonprofit in New York City. And I was part of this kind of budding CSA program that they were building out and getting, local fresh produce into, neighborhoods throughout New York City that typically don't have access to vegetables like that, or certainly not to local produce. And I felt really passionate about it all. And I really thought that I understood the whole landscape of that system. And little did I know, I was drinking wine at that time that was just completely removed from any notion of the earth, maybe. I mean, of course, all wine comes from grapes, which are grown in the earth. But the wine that I was drinking at the time was just, it was mostly mass produced, kind of generic stuff. So
yeah. It took me. Totally. My first wine experience was definitely you mentioned wine coolers in your book, which actually that would have been my first
Yeah.
wine, and then White Zinfandel, and it took me a while to sort of realize, oh wait, if I'm thinking about food this way, where is the wine coming from? And there's just something about a lot of the way that wine is marketed is this idea that it does come from the place and it comes from the ground, but it's more like a lifestyle as opposed to an actual agricultural product, and how is it being grown and who is picking it and all of that, which kind of gets us into, like, I mean, you sort of stumbled through Bloomer Creek into this world of natural wine. So what, for people who haven't read the book cover to cover, let's just talk a little bit about just kind of what that means.
What natural wine means?
Yeah.
So, so for me, and again, I should reiterate that, some of you may know that natural wine it doesn't have like a regulating body in the United States. We don't have a label that we can put on wine that verifies that it's natural. So when I define natural wine, I do it somewhat loosely, and basically what I believe it is kind of what the community tends to agree on. But again, it's not like saying like organic, which is actually like a regulated thing. So to me, natural wine always starts with organic or biodynamic grapes, not necessarily certified biodynamic or organic. Mm-hmm. It can be non-certified organic grapes, just as long as they weren't sprayed with synthetic pesticides or herbicides or fungicides. And then from there, it's, typically or always made using native or ambient yeast. So the winemakers will not necessarily be using like cultivated yeast in their product to kick off fermentation. Usually hand-picked grapes. That just kind of tends to be, I think, the standard for most natural winemakers. Minimal to no fining or filtering. So they're going to leave, all that beautiful sediment or yeast or what have you, grape skins and things like that, that can still be present in the wine itself. They're not going to strip all of that out. And there are natural methods of filtering, of course. I won't get into the real nitty gritty, but yeah, minimally.
We're not chemistry class time.
You can go there though.
That's at midnight.
And what else? No fining, no filtering. Okay, minimal sulfur usually. This is maybe one of the more contentious topics in natural wine, but the community tends to agree that maybe sulfites not in excess of like 70 parts per million, I think that's on the high side for natural. Mm-hmm. My personal threshold tends to be maybe more like 30 or 40. But that's, again, maybe a little bit technical.
Well, and for reference, and then we're going to stop talking about the numbers, but even wine that is certified, I believe wine that is certified as being made from organic grapes, that's 100 is allowed. And then in a lot of conventional wines, you'll see like 300 milligrams. So just to give people some idea of what the numbers are, but that's something, because it does have a number, and a lot of wine people like to fixate on the numbers. It's something that a lot of people will get hung up on, but it's definitely not the most interesting part of the conversation. So we had that.
Not to mention, I mean, and I won't get too into it, but you aren't really going to notice a difference in your wine if it's like, between 10 sulfites versus 60 or something. Like you might if you're like a real wine pro, but I think things start to get a little cloudy in there.
Speaking of cloudy,
that's pretty much it. I mean, I think like the kind of what is the phrase? Nothing added, nothing removed is a fairly safe phrase to fall back on with natural wine. Yeah.
There's a great quote in the book that you get from Kim of Bloomer Creek, where he says that natural wine is a process, not an end result.
Yeah.
And I think like we taught in some ways, I think when people think about natural wine, like there's this idea in some wine bars that if it's not cloudy, if it's not light red, if it's not an orange wine, it's not a natural wine. And I think the quote, like if you want to just talk a little bit about thoughts on that, I think that quote really sort of crystallizes that idea.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel, again, I feel so lucky to have kind of had my initiation into natural wine with somebody like Kim Engel and his partner, Deborah Birmingham, because yeah, they are real vignerons. Like they are farmers through and through. They farm their land, they pick their grapes, they crush their grapes, they bottle them, you like everything from start to finish. And so I think Kim is maybe one of the best people to really kind of reiterate that, yeah, natural wine is it's about the process, you know, it's not about like trying to achieve a flavor at the end that is distinctly natural, which unfortunately I think that, you know, that is starting to happen maybe, that, you know, people might start to think that natural wine has to be X, Y, or Z, when in reality, it's more about like the journey to getting there. And, you know, the end product can really be, like natural wine is on such a spectrum. You can have, you know, incredibly refined, kind of clean tasting natural wines. And I say that word with, you know, a grain of salt, clean, because it's not very descriptive. But yeah, all the way to, you know, a super cloudy glass that might, you know, taste close to kombucha or something like that. But yeah, I think it's really about the integrity of the winemaker and them making sure that they are creating something kind of as hands-off as possible throughout.
And then I think that gets back to like this idea that it is sort of an agricultural product, yeah, because you can't, you know, this idea that it's a process, not an end result, but yet there's this idea of, well, it has to look a certain way, or it has to be a certain color, or it has to sort of fit this little box of what a natural wine is, in a way that gets away from like this idea of you can't, like Bloomer Creek, what they're making up in the Finger Lakes where it's cold and chilly, they're making a wine that will be very, very different than what you would make if you were growing Riesling in Australia. Same grape, same idea, but just like you're not trying to force it into a box. You're expressing where it came from.
Yeah, and I think the more that people can start to connect the fact that what ends up in your glass is made, it's a farm product, it's an agricultural product, then we can finally maybe stop with some of the expectations of like what natural wine is supposed to be, or even what conventional wine is supposed to be, you know. I really do believe that, you know, I don't believe in demonizing conventional wine. It's not personally what I drink, but there are definitely conventional wines that are being made with integrity, or, you know, maybe being made in the best possible way that winemaker or farmer is able to make it. So yeah, I think, you know, as long as they maintain some, you know, honesty throughout the process, then we should all have respect for that, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think it's great as people start to, I sort of feel like one of the things that the natural wine movement has done is it's started this conversation about where does wine come from and who is growing it. And as that becomes sort of more of a mainstream conversation and who's picking it and all of those things that are actually related to how does it get from that vine into this bottle, that's a conversation that I think we are starting to hopefully see trickle into more of the conventional wines. And that's fantastic, because those are wines where you're making a lot of product. And if you can start to, if those wines can start to treat the earth a certain way and their people a certain way, that's an important thing, and that starts to change the world.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, you know, if you think about it, it hasn't even been that long that we have been starting to connect where our food comes from and what our food systems look like. So I really don't blame wine for being kind of, or wine drinkers, for being kind of late to the game. I think we still have a ways to go, but I think it's so exciting that there are a lot of wine drinkers out there now that really do care about, you know, where things are coming from. and not just like, give me your funkiest glass, you know?
Yes, that's just, you know, that's in many ways that's just as sort of like annoying as a retailer to be like, what's your most expensive wine? Or do you give me your 100-point wines? Or just, it's like, what do you want? Like, what do you like? Like, don't you want to hear about, some people, you know, not everybody wants to hear about the farmer and the goat and this and that,
Right,
but like,
yeah.
at least know there was a farmer and a goat, somebody
Right.
picking the grapes.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and also it's like, I think American wine culture this might be distinct. Well, I don't want to say it's distinctly American to kind of be maybe somewhat disconnected from our food system, but I do think, you know, wine has always been held up on a pedestal in America where, at least when I was growing up, I was always made to think that wine was super, super fancy and that it was, you know, kind of off limits. Obviously, it was off limits when I was a child, obviously, but off limits, just, you know, from a socioeconomic standpoint. And I really think that, you know, that's one of the barriers that natural wine is starting to break down, which I really love, is that it can really be for everyone. It doesn't have to be this thing that is like reviewed in magazines on this lofty point system or only served at like the finest restaurants, you know. That's kind of also why I'm a big champion of American wines made in America. Is I think something about them at least feels very soulful to me, and yeah.
Well, and that's something that I think we're starting to hear more about is, I mean, as Americans, like you were saying, it's on the pedestal and we tend to look to like European culture as sort of the center of where wine culture came from, which is not necessarily true. Well, it's not true at all. It came from Georgia and the country, not the state. And I think when we start to talk about American wine culture and what does that really mean, we can start to talk about things like skin ferments, co-ferments, cider and grapes, and all of these sort of wine stories that sort of involve people that get left out of the wine story in many, many cases. So that's kind of something that's exciting and I think is one of the next waves of where this conversation goes.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see like how New York winemaking is going to look even in 5 years. You know, usually I would be saying like 10 years from now, but I think New York winemaking is also changing so rapidly. And there are so many cool new low intervention winemakers that like in 5 years, I feel like it's going to be exploding. So
yeah, well, and you mentioned you have like I love it, entire like 2 pages to get devoted to Piquette in your book. Which we're seeing Piquettes. The first one I ever saw was from New York, but I had one from Oregon at a wine competition. Like,
really?
Oh, we had 5 Piquettes that we were judging at the Texom International Wine Awards, and I had to give a quick little lesson on Piquette and explain like it was wild. So let's do a really quick, what's a Piquette?
Yeah. So I love talking about Piquette because it's kind of, I don't know if it's a full circle for me, but Todd Cavallo of Wild Ark, which is in the Hudson Valley in New York State. Todd, when he started making natural wine, and I actually featured him in the very first issue of my magazine, the Wine Zine. So he was like really early on, kind of part of my wine journey also. And Todd, it turns out, had actually kind of been brainstorming about Piquette with someone named Tristan Guild, who's from Kingston Wine Co., which Kingston Wine Co. was a shop also very early on when I was learning about natural wine, and they were just super welcoming to me and all of that. So I don't know, I love the Piquette thing because it does feel like a little bit like some of my origin in this whole journey. But yeah, to cut to the chase, so Piquette, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not great at defining it.
It's a work in progress.
Without my book in front of me, but it's, so it's a wine, I guess you would call it a wine product. It's not technically wine. It's made from the grape pomace, which is the leftover grape skins that exist after you press the grape for wine. And so that pomace is basically used, fermented, and diluted into like a lightly fermented, kind of low ABV, almost like a wine spritzer, something like that. Usually coming in at around like think maybe 6% ABV, right?
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah, the ones that we tend to see on the market, in many cases, they're adding a little bit of still wine to kind of get it up to 7 or 8%.
Oh, right. Okay.
But the first fermentation probably gets it to, I think, like around 3%. I think Todd says they start at like 3% because remember, this is from back in the days when water would not be terribly safe to drink. So a really low alcoholic solution would be what you would, drink while you're out doing whatever you're doing in the fields.
Yeah. And I love that, especially with Todd's piquettes. Actually, I think that Wild Ark is maybe the only piquette that I've had. So
I've had many.
I think Old Westminster is also making a great one, I've heard, over in Maryland, right? But I love that, Todd is working with a lot of hybrid grapes, like I think Marquette and Traminette, and he's making piquettes also out of hybrid grapes, which is just, I don't know, they're these beautiful colors, and they're like a bit musky, and they're just really, really cool. They're fascinating to me.
And they come in at usually like under $20 on the shelf for the most part, which is fantastic because he gets a second use of everything in his winery. So he's able to use these piquettes, which come to market very quickly. So he's getting cash in, and then that allows him to keep the prices on the rest of his wines at a lower price. Oh, and there's a question. It's like it's not like a really like an effervescent grappa. It's more like a wine, but like a wine spritzer. So it's very low in alcohol. And if you can imagine, you've got the gunk that's left after the wine is made. You soak it in water, and it picks up just a little bit of the flavor and just a little bit of the fermentation, and then you bottle it. So that's basically what it is. So it's definitely like a wine spritz.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned that you talked to Todd as part of the Wine Zine. So let's now like get into the Wine Zine and the book and how you wound up with the book. Oh, and piquettes, page 72 and 73. That's where you can read more about them.
You're amazing. Thank you. I would have never been able to figure that out. And I sadly don't have my book in front of me, so thank you. So I guess with the Wine Zine, I started that magazine in 2017. This was probably, maybe 2 years into me really like tasting natural wine and doing what I could to talk to people about it. But I really was kind of feeling like not in it as much as I wanted to be. I tend to be rather obsessive when I find something that I love. And with natural wine, it really just kind of split my brain open. And I was like, I wasn't going to be happy just drinking it. And I knew that. So, I had dabbled in some indie publishing throughout my 20s and helped friends out with their projects, doing some editing. And I was managing editor of a great quarterly magazine called Wilder. And I just felt like that medium, print, really felt familiar to me and kind of comforting to me. And with wine, I was like, I don't know any other way to kind of share and profess my love for this thing and explore more about it than to start a little print project. So I started the Wine Zine, and we are now on issue 5, which actually it comes out next week. I wanted to give a little teaser of the cover. Actually, I'm really excited. So this is the new Wine Zine, and issue 5. And it's really always just kind of been, a way to talk to people in wine and to reach out to winemakers and ask them questions and kind of have a reason to be asking them questions, but also provide a platform to, other people who are curious about natural wine and maybe want to write about it for the first time, or, want to write a weird little essay about falling in love with piquette, or, all sorts of things. So it's really always kind of felt a little bit experimental to me, and I love it.
No, it's a great way to have an excuse to reach out to people.
Totally.
I always want to ask the questions, but I need to have a reason to ask the questions.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I mean, and now, I think the Wine Zine kind of gave me the confidence that I needed to really kind of feel like part of the community in a way. Not that you need a project in order to, be a part of the community, but it kind of satisfied this urge that I had to like share my love for something and also find people who were equally obsessed and kind of just go all in on it together.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's fun. I love that the zine format is something that we're seeing more of, because I think it is just such a great way to like get out there, ask questions, pursue your passion, learn something,
Totally. Yeah. And I think like I've always been really I've felt like it's really important for me to stick to a kind of tone of voice and approach that is as unpretentious as I think natural wine should be. So really just like super, super welcoming. Again, like I've published so many people for the first time who maybe didn't consider themselves writers, or, even had a lot of winemakers write for me who would have never in a million years imagined themselves writing about wine. And those actually tend to be some of my favorite pieces, because winemakers are always like, oh, I'm not a writer. I'm actually, I've tried, but I'm terrible at it. And then they just write these like beautifully passionate, just really open pieces about what they're doing. And it's just been really fun to learn from people and learn with people.
Cool.
And it led to my book.
Yes. Well, let's talk a little bit about the book. Just the process of writing that and how you kind of made the leap from a zine to a book.
Yeah. Well, so I actually, full disclosure, never intended on writing a book. It wasn't necessarily something that was on my list. I imagined that maybe, 10 issues down the line, maybe the Wine Zine, we would have a little like compilation of best of or something. But I never really imagined that I personally would be writing a book. But I, was very fortunate to have had the Wine Zine be seen by a great editor with Running Press Books and Hachette. And this was in 2018, 2019. And they approached me and they were just really excited about, the kind of look and feel of the Wine Zine and how it felt, kind of introductory, but also, really curious. And they essentially asked me to write like an introductory book in that same spirit. So, having never written a book, I really kind of just dove into it. And, that process of writing a book as you are still learning about natural wine was both super exhilarating and totally terrifying because I was my own, I was learning as I was researching, and I was fact checking myself and frantically reaching out to winemakers and asking them if I was getting things right. And it was a really fun process. I wouldn't do it any other way. But it did, my timeline was really, really tight. I wrote the entire book in about 6 months. So yeah, I luckily started it in the spring. So I did manage to, visit some wineries in both New York and California. Luckily, the pandemic was still a year away when I was writing. And yeah, it came together. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh no, go.
I will mention also a lot of the parts in the Wine Zine, I wanted to, in Wine Unfiltered, kind of replicate from the Wine Zine, which felt like, you'll see those little specials on Piquette or, a section like, do winemakers still foot stomp their grapes? These nice little kind of curious asides. Those were kind of the most fun part to write for me.
Yeah, I love the questions Like the idea that
Yeah.
you have I'm always like, I go to vineyards all the time. Well, not anymore, eventually someday soon again, but you're always like, what do I ask? What do I ask? And I like that there are questions to ask if you happen to get to meet a winemaker, or if you're in a vineyard, or like, be still my heart when you go into a wine store.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that process can be so intimidating. Like it still is intimidating for me, which I'm sure some people would laugh at, but it's like, it's when you're really trying to learn about something in earnest, it's a vulnerable position to be in, I think. So I'm just really into kind of trying to make people more comfortable during that process. Yeah, whether they're visiting a vineyard or a wine shop.
Yeah.
You know,
Some
yeah, we're all human.
good tips in there. And what would, I guess, for anybody who's listening who is looking to learn more about wine, what would aside from buying your book, what would be some of your top tips?
Yeah, so this feels like one of my secrets, and I don't talk about it a lot, but I think that there is a hidden treasure trove in a lot of wine shops' websites. To really just peruse wine shops' websites and click through those products and familiarize yourself with, like, oh, this shop has, 50 wines from Southwest France. And then really kind of seeing, like, looking at the grapes that, are utilized in those wines versus maybe the grapes that are utilized in the Georgia section or the New York section. And I think it really starts to paint a picture. Like, this is kind of what I spent a lot of my time doing during the pandemic, because, like, I wasn't in wine shops, I wasn't in wine bars. I luckily had a nice little network of friends to be talking to about wine, but I was really missing that, like, educational component. And aside from the obvious great books that are out there, like Alice Firing is a great writer on and champion of low intervention wines. I felt like this was kind of my way to do, like, research on my own time, was really just to dig around. Like, I love, Chambers Street Wine has a great website with a lot of information on it. Your website is great for Copic Wineworks, Kingston Wine Co. And it's also fun because you get to read, in some cases, the descriptions of the wines, which are written by a lot of the staff or the owners. And you can start to pick up, like, tasting notes from individual people. And yeah, I think it's kind of a little treasure trove out there.
That's cool. And that is, like, reading, especially during the pandemic, all the shops. I mean, a lot of shops had been selling online to begin with, but with the pandemic and everybody having to move to sort of curbside pickup, everybody sort of upped their game. And it is a really good way to read. When you read a bunch of different people sort of take on tasting notes, in a way, it's kind of freeing, because you're like, oh, well, I can talk about it. Chamber Street talks about it one way. They're a little technical, but they've met all the people. Others are more like free form and what you should be drinking it with, and like where you should. And so it's a good way to sort of, I think, realize that there's not one way to talk about wine.
Exactly. And, like, an extension of that, I think, is signing up for wine shops newsletters. Like Domestique is doing a really great one. Kingston Wine Co. has a great one. And that kind of adds that, like, other layer of, just personality. And you really can kind of glean a little bit more history or things like that. And of course, while you're using these websites as little research vessels, also be sure to buy wine from these people. Just use their websites, actually buy from them too.
That's helpful. And then they can keep the websites running. Yeah. And I mean, because I'm a retailer, so of course my top tip is always find a good retailer that you love. And whenever you are shopping for wine into a store, you've got a lot of great tips in the book, like the questions to ask and that kind of thing. But, like, one of the top things that I always ask is, what do you want to spend? because a lot of people will sort of dance around it, and a good shop should be able to find you, as long as you're not looking for a $6 bottle of natural wine, should be able to find something that will fit the bill.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely an advocate for more, I don't know, I guess not transparency in wine pricing, but I hope that people can get to a place where they feel comfortable saying like, yeah, I'm looking just for a $15, $16 bottle, instead of maybe feeling like you have to spend $30 in order to get a good natural wine. Like there, you know, of course, maybe things get a little bit more complex or a tad bit more interesting, I might say, if you go up to $25, but there are totally suitable natural wines out there for under 20.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Wines that are well farmed, that are made by a person.
Totally. Yeah, the one that we're drinking, 22, I think.
Yes.
Years.
So probably somewhere, there we go, somewhere between 20 and 22, probably, depending on where you get it. And I didn't look it up, so I can't say what the grapes are. I used to know, but I've forgotten. Now I just drink it.
Cayuga White and Seyval. Super cool. Yeah. Both hybrid grapes, right? Yeah. Seyval is a hybrid as well.
Seyval is a hybrid. Cayuga is either, I think it's a hybrid as well, or a non-vinifera grape.
Non-vinifera.
Yeah. Trying to figure out what to call them.
I love this wine, and I love hybrid grapes, and yeah, I'm really into this one.
Yeah.
Obviously love an American wine.
Yeah. From Maine.
Yeah. Made in Maine with Finger Lakes grapes.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe we could start to get into some questions, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's question time.
Hi again.
Hello.
For anyone listening in tonight, we would gladly take your questions. You can submit them into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. On the comments side, we had some folks recommending different wines that they were drinking earlier. T. Martin said Native Species Winery in Michigan makes excellent piquettes. Let's see, who is this person?
Oh, I've been wanting to try wines from Michigan. I still have never had a Michigan wine.
They've got a really lovely wine scene out there.
Yeah, I had Left Foot Charlie was the brand that we carried at my shop. And I remember we did, when I had the shop down in Tribeca, we did an in-store tasting, and we would always put the chalkboard up, and it said wines from Michigan. And it was the chalkboard in all of the years that I had that shop where people would actually like stick their heads in and say, what's the winery? And we'd be like, Left Foot Charlie. And they would say, oh my God, I love it. I love Michigan wine. I'm from Ohio, so it kills me that our most popular chalkboard sign ever was about Michigan wine, but there's awesome wine there.
I need to get into it. If anyone has more Michigan wine suggestions, happily take them.
We'd love your suggestions.
Yeah, I wrote that one down to go visit when I'm in Ohio.
Also Bel Lago Winery. That looks like that's another one. El Mobby. And
oh wow, May is Michigan Wine Month. Oh my gosh, I need to get out there. How many days do I have left in Michigan? Oh, I've got 2 weeks left in May. Maybe I'll make it out in June.
And I saw someone is actually drinking a Piquette.
Oh yeah?
Yep.
From Swick Wine.
Joe Swick.
Joe Swick. He also wrote for issue 1 of the Wine Zine. Yeah, it was an amazing piece. And also, I should mention, issues 1 through 3 are sold out, but they're available for download on our website if you are curious, or if you want to read Joe Swick's crazy piece about comparing winemaking to music, and how sometimes he makes Steely Dan wines and sometimes he makes Smash Mouth wines. It's a really fun piece. So that's in the Wine Zine 01.
Yeah. His mother lived around, I think she lived around the corner from the shop, or she was somewhere in the neighborhood, and he would send her with sample bottles to like drop off at the shops. And so she'd walk in and she's like, Joe sent me. And we're like, Joe Swick?
We do have one question come through from Leah. Leah asks, what are some of your favorite Pacific Northwest wines?
Ooh, good question. Pacific Northwest, kind of, it's not like a region that I'm super familiar with in the US. Obviously love Joe Swick's wines. Think those are really good. The Marini, I'm really into what he's doing.
Oh yeah.
The Marini is, I forget what his name is, embarrassingly. But yeah, he makes some really cool like carbonic stuff. Let's see, what else? Yeah. Wine Farm is doing some cool stuff. Kind of a little bit on the pricier side, but you know, really beautifully farmed, and he's got some really cool stuff going on up there with like a really biodiverse vineyards and things like that.
Bow and Arrow?
Bow and Arrow is great. I've only had their wine once, maybe. But yeah, I found it at Kingston Wine Co. You know, I've been dying to try Brianne Day's wines.
Oh yeah.
I've heard she's incredible. Yeah, it's kind of funny. I have no excuses really, but Pacific Northwest is like a little bit of a blind spot for me.
Yeah. And I have to try Bree Stock, who's a Masters of Wine. She's made a piquette, which I need to get my little hands on under her limited edition label. Yeah, so this is turning into a piquette talk, but it's taking
Wine Zine, do you know if they're in New York?
They are. Her piquette is not in New York, but her wines, I believe, are in New York. So I'm going to be checking those out. So yeah.
So many great recommendations in the chat too. Folks sharing their different favorite Pacific Northwest winemakers. And there was a question about where to buy natural wine in Seattle. And I see a lot of folks +1 for Veef Wine Shop in Fremont. Did you have any other recommendations, Catherine? I know there was one that you had mentioned.
Sorry, the question was where to buy
natural wine in Seattle.
Ooh,
Let's see.
Okay.
A lot of folks for Veef.
I'm trying to think of there are at least 2 people in Seattle that carry the Wine Zine, and one of them is Juice Club, I believe. Yeah, and the other one I can't remember. But yeah, I think you might be a better than I do about Seattle.
There's a lot of folks in the chat mentioning Molly's Bottle Shop as well.
Oh, cool. I've never heard of Molly's Bottle Shop.
Yeah. Viff is in your book.
Oh, and Viff. Oh, yeah. And of course, my book also has like a great index in the back of all sorts of wine shops throughout the United States, which was a collaboration that I did with Raisin, which is a great app that lets you kind of locate natural wine bars and shops and vineyards all throughout the world, actually, not just the US. So yeah.
Yeah. And we could probably tell you more about producers that we're seeing in New York and in Vermont. The thing about so many of these natural wine producers, especially as we're seeing them in the American scene, is their production is so small that they sell what they've got in their backyards, which is great for everyone's backyard. And hopefully we'll start to see them kind of spread across the country. But you know, that's the joy and the pain of small production wine.
Yeah.
And the beauty.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's tough too. And I mean, yeah, I guess it just kind of comes with the territory, but seeing all these great things that are, you know, that California has access to that New York doesn't yet. So it's hard because we all feel so close in this community. It's so intimate, but we don't all necessarily have access to the same thing. So
yeah, but it's good. It makes it you know, we tend to think like, oh, I'm going to go to wine country, I'm going to go to France, or I'm going to go to Italy. But increasingly it's like, no, I'm going to go to Michigan, or I need to learn so much more about what's happening in Washington. And so it makes American travel much more enticing now that there's exciting wine scenes growing up all over the place.
For sure. Yeah, I want to get to Mexico, see what's happening there. Yeah.
We've got another question from Giuliani. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. What are your current favorite wines and producers, and what makes them memorable?
Ooh, I should have had this list in my head before this. One does come to mind that I'm really into right now. I don't think I have multiple that come to mind because I'm really a creature of habit with wine drinking. It's, you know, I tend to have the ones that I fall back on. Obviously, Bloomer Creek, like I'm 25% Bloomer Creek made up of that. But anyway, aside from the ones that I'm drinking all the time, I did just get acquainted with a really great new to us, I guess, Argentinian producer. I believe their full name is Finca Las Payas. And they're making a really, really great Carignan right now. Super, you know, basically absolutely nothing added. It's like pure farm wine. Really, really fresh. I think Carignan is a really cool grape too. And I don't know, it's, you know, I tend to fall in love with new wines for the story and for, you know, maybe that sounds rather typical, but of course the wine needs to be good, but it's more like, I really want to know the story of what the farmer is doing and, you know, how long they've been doing it. And I don't know, I was really kind of taken with the story of Finca Las Payas and his commitment to really making something truly hands-off in a wine region that isn't necessarily known for that, Argentina. And also working with grapes that, you know, have been somewhat forgotten. So yeah, love that wine. What about you, Christy? Any current favorites?
Oh gosh, that's it's like which of my children are my favorite? Which is a quote in your book, actually. You said that. I was like, wait, I say that all the time too. I will say which are going to become my favorites, or a region that I'm really starting to look to explore. Lebanon. There is, and I need to set up a tasting date with one of my sales reps with Knit Wines, who's just brought in a bunch of Lebanese wines, and they're called like Lebnats instead of Nats.
Yeah.
And they're Jardin from Knit. And so Chateau Moussard is probably the Lebanese producer that, like, if you've heard of a Lebanese producer, you've heard of Chateau Moussard. It goes back to like the 1930s, and it's a very, very storied producer, but there's so much that's happening there right now. And I kind of like stumbled in an Instagram live post that Sade was doing with one of her winemakers, and it was just so exciting hearing about like the indigenous grapes they have, Obeidi and Merlot, and things that I've always known about through the Chateau Moussard story, but like starting to think about it more broadly, and I'm excited to try those wines. So that'll be my new favorite region.
Yeah, I had the Lebnat on my list at Time Cafe in Chinatown last year, just before we shut down. And just before we shut down for the long sleep. But those wines are so cool. And, you know, he's the first pet nat producer in all of Lebanon, apparently. Eddie Shami, I think is.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he is in this new issue of the Wine Zine also.
Oh, awesome. And it was a fascinating story because he was talking about, you know, we think of Lebanon as someplace that's really hot, and the Bekaa Valley clearly is, but he was talking about some of these non-vinifera grapes that they're using in Vermont that they're starting to think about growing up in the hills of Lebanon, which is just crazy. But you think about how much the altitude impacts what they can grow. And I was like, wait, we're talking about non-vinifera hybrid grapes that you would see in New York in the Finger Lakes up in the hills. It was crazy. It was awesome.
Yeah, so cool.
Exciting.
Yeah, equally excited.
Yeah. P. Martin is asking, what was the Lebanese winery's name again? Would you understand?
I don't know. I know who my distributor is.
Yeah, Eddie Shami is the Chami. He is the winemaker at Mersel Wines.
Okay.
MERSEL. And then there's Couvent Rouge, which is also kind of part of that whole collective. but I don't know. I think Lebnat is technically being made by Couvent Rouge. But yeah, it's kind of a collective of winemakers, and they're all kind of sharing things. So.
Yeah, and there's an import, like in New York specifically, because everything has to come through from an importer into a distributor. There's a distributor called Knit Wines, which is bringing in a number of these wineries in that collective. So I'll know much more about them in about a month.
We'll have to gather in Seattle and talk about it more over some Pacific Northwest wine.
And try some local stuff.
Right. We've got one more question. So maybe let's answer this one from Ted. It's he says, or they say, favorite myths about natural wines, and what are the facts? That one is the wrap up.
I have one that immediately comes to mind. I have two that immediately come to mind. One might be the more well-known one, which is that natural wine does not give you a hangover. I do not think this is true.
It's not true.
It's not true. It's, I think it's a combination of a few things. I do think, let's just, for the sake of this conversation, call it non-natural wine or conventional wine. I do think that perhaps because a lot of it has a lot of extra stuff beyond just fermented grapes, preservatives and clarifying agents, and sometimes oak essence and things like that. So that extra stuff that is in some conventional wine can certainly possibly make you feel worse the next day. Again, not a scientist, so I'm not going to say, absolutely, but maybe. So there's a possibility that you might feel a bit worse after you drink a lot of conventional wine. However, I think that natural wine, it can absolutely, it's alcohol at the end of the day. It is hard for your body to process, especially in excess. I always tell people to just really just try to keep your balance with it and make sure that you're hydrating yourself when you're drinking natural wine. It's not like a miracle thing that you're, not going to feel bad the next day. And one other thing about that is I think sometimes people might think that they don't feel as bad after they drink a lot of natural wine, because sometimes these can be lower ABV. So some natural wines, come in as low as like 9-10%. Whereas I think a lot of conventional wine, stylistically, and maybe also just because of the way the wine is made, they can be like 14% ABV plus. So obviously you're consuming higher alcohol percentages at that rate. So that could also be a reason that maybe you don't feel as bad with natural wine, but I definitely, I can confirm that you can get a hangover on natural wine.
Funny story. So I had somebody who worked at the shop who had gone to Paris and came back and was very into natural wine. And he had was it his 30th birthday? Whatever birthday it was, there was a lot of wine consumed, and he was still very much in this, I'm not going to get a hangover. I'm not going to get a hangover. And the next day I call him at like 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, so what do you think? He's like, it's not true. Like, it's not true. But there is a study, one study. So it's just the very beginnings of a study. And it was, I would have to go find the link, but Alice wrote about it in the Firing Line newsletter, where it was a study in, I believe they took two different Soaves, two different Italian whites, and they tried to pair them in terms of a number of different wines, kind of pairing them in terms of conventional versus organically farmed, perhaps additives, no additives, same amount of alcohol, like everything as much as possible, kind of keeping them the same. And they actually, I guess you can do this in Italy, you can't do it in the US. They had people drink them at the same sort of pace and report how they felt. And while the people that drank the natural wine clearly still got drunk, there was something about it was almost as if it was absorbed more steadily. So there was something that was different about the quality of the buzz, so to speak.
Right.
And, you know, one study, very sort of early kind of evidence, but there was something to it. But the end result was you will still get a hangover, but perhaps if you're kind of keeping it at a moderate, even keel, it sort of moderates itself a little bit more.
I need to read that piece. It was
I'll find it.
Newsletter, you said?
It was in the firing line newsletter, Alice's newsletter.
Cool.
So yeah. No, I was surprised. And I'm very into statistics, and I went through it with like I was like, you can say this, you can't see this. Like, oh, but that's what the results were.
Right. That maybe when wine is, you know, not clouded with all this other stuff, or, you know, have all these additives, that it affects the body in maybe a more pure way or something. I mean,
intuitively, there just has to be something true about that. But, you know, just because you know, I love science, but there's things you don't know until you prove it. And we just haven't looked at that. So how would we know or not know?
Yeah.
Sounds like we've debunked it.
Only part of it. You still will get a hangover. You absolutely will still get a hangover.
Any favorite myths about natural wine from your end, Christy?
I mean, mine, we talked a little bit about it, but like this idea that I think I would hope everybody that is on here today has moved beyond this idea that if it's natural wine, it has to be funky and it has to be gross. Yeah, I think we've moved beyond that. Like, what natural wine does not have to be funky. Natural wine also can be relatively clear. It doesn't have to be cloudy. You can have a beautiful 14.5% alcohol wine that is totally natural, that just happens to come from a really warm climate. So this idea of natural wine is a style. I hate that. Hate that. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I feel like I learned so much about wine and natural wine tonight. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Katherine, congratulations again on Wine Unfiltered. And thank you for sending us signed book plates. For anyone that's interested in purchasing a copy, we do have signed copies, which is always lovely to have.
I had a lot of fun with those, and I like doodled some grapes and wine glasses and
For anyone that's interested in purchasing a copy of the book, those are available at booklarder.com. We do ship nationwide, so we can send those over to the East Coast, and we also ship worldwide too, in case you're listening from further away. Like I mentioned before, our talk will be posted on our YouTube channel. So if you would like to watch this back and remember some of the wines that we talked about, that will be available on our YouTube channel. And that's all we have time for tonight. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in and chatted in the chat. I loved seeing all the lovely messages and recommendations that folks had today. So thank you for sharing.
Thanks everyone.
That's all. Thank you both for joining us. See you hopefully in person when it's safe to travel again, and coming through for your next book.
I hope so.
All right.
Thanks again.
Have a good night.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.